Hi, and welcome everyone. Happy Wednesday. It's good to be with you all again. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome to this week's edition of Chat with Chet. So, today we're going to try something a little bit different. We're going to go back into the basics that we've been playing with kind of throughout this whole course, and specifically the very fundamentals of D3. And today, what we're going to do is look at the fundamentals of D3, but spin it as kind of a comparison, kind of a launch off point for those who have more familiarity with a different program, Watchout, which was actually one of the programs that I was more familiar with when I came over to start working with D3, or Disguise as it's called. So I'm going to go ahead and launch off into it then. So here's my desktop. We're all very familiar with it now. I'm a taskbar on top type of person, which most people are not, but it comes from my days of doing Linux. Hi, Adam Bishop. Thank you for joining. So let's begin by discussing D3 Manager as opposed to the Watchout Manager. So D3 Manager, and let's actually just go ahead and open Watchout just so that we have it. I installed it today because I haven't used it in a bit. So here's the Watchout Manager, new show, open recent shows, fairly simplistic. D3 is a little bit more options going with it, and some things are very important here. For instance, everything for the D3 folder, you have to define a D3 projects folder that all of your projects are going to live inside. By default on a computer, that's stored in your documents folder. If you're working on a server, there's a separate D drive where all of those live. Watchout gives you a little bit more flexibility on that. If I want to change it, I can, of course, go here and add a new D3 projects folder. I'll do that often if I want to work off of, say, a fast SSD drive plugged in so that I can move all the media onto that and not take up space on my hard drive, because these shows can get to be rather large. But one of the other big things here is this networking tab. This will show every computer running D3 on the network, and it also allows us to define what network D3 net's going to discuss and talk to all the machines on. Now, D3 is very good about dealing with multiple networks as long as you define what network in particular is D3's actual conversation network for the control. But once that's defined, you can have a separate NIC for ArtNet, DMX work, a separate NIC for automation, a separate NIC for content transfer so that you can use a full 10 gig. Or if you want to go down the route of lagging two NICs together, you can VLAN that and have a lot of options for it. So here are all of our projects. I'm going to go ahead. We're going to work in Chat with Chet 6, open project folder. And so here are the standard folders inside a D3 projects folder. The big thing to note is, unlike working with Watchout, where I have a lot of flexibility what my folder structure is going to be, D3 is very rigid about where certain things need to go. And this is actually something I hit earlier today, tinkering. So if we open our objects folder, this is where all the objects we're going to access in the show is, whether it's going to be an HTML file for a web site, a notch file, or the big ones are video file and DX texture. Video file is where I'm going to store most of my media in this day and age. I can store still images there as well as moving pictures, videos. DX texture will also have content that I can access, but only through, say, a bitmap layer, which we'll go into a little bit of that later once we talk about the timeline. So in the video file folder, you can see we've got our default pieces there. I'm going to go ahead and just drag in my training video. That way I've got some moving media to work with. By default, they don't populate anything in there. I can fire up projects here. So let's go ahead and let's jump into a project. So Chat with Chet 006 for edition 6. Let's go ahead and get into that. I've developed a really... This will drop us into D3 proper, and this is going to look far different than what we're familiar with working in watchout. So a couple things to note about it. Rather than having a bunch of dockable windows as watchout is, we've got this big viewport that we're working with primarily. So this is our stage view. There's three major components to disguise. The stage view here, which is our 3D visualizer, it shows us our world where things are in actual position. Down here at the bottom, this is going to be our timeline where we're going to do our sequencing. And then the feed view, this is the feed, this is our output. Whereas watchout kind of combines the output and the visualizer stage, D3 separates them out so that you can work in one and not have to think about the other and vice versa. It gets to be kind of an interesting thought process as it goes. So D3 is always in 3 dimensions. You can see even the basic project has one projector and one surface it's projecting onto. Watchout definitely wins when it comes to strict 2D workflow. Watchout is very well designed to understand just 2D. And at times I find that it's easier to set up a watchout show than it is to set up a disguise show. In particular, we'll look at a trick for this later, but notice how there has to be this relationship between the projector and the surface we're projecting onto. I kind of need to put that in for at least a starting point as I'm working if I want to use this as a previs program. And that's what drew me to D3 originally, is the fact that it's really beneficial as a 3D visualizer. I will do shows for myself where I use D3 to previs the show, even if I'm not going to use D3 for playback. And so that's an interesting change, whereas I would have to think long and hard about if I really wanted to use watchout as a previs piece of tool as well. I find it's really great for setting up the outputs and doing it that way. So basically, think about working in D3 as if you're working in the 3D mode and watchout the whole time. When it comes to surfaces and projectors, these are going to have resolutions. So if I want to access an object to get its information, I can right-click on it, and it will give me a pop-up window of the name of it and then all the settings that we can change inside. So currently, this is basically one 1080p output. A fairly easy show. We'll expand beyond that as we go along. The projector works as essentially a virtual camera. It's kind of like how in watchout, when you're working in 3D mode, you're applying stuff through virtual displays onto the 3D model. Same principle applies here. However, it's a little bit more advanced. There's a lot of blending things on top of it. It gives us a lot more flexibility in how we apply it. And then the projector actually just works as a camera. So when we look at how we actually calibrate projectors, we will do that. So you can see the projector, we will apply what surfaces it can see. In this case, currently it can only see surface 1. And then surface 1 is a projector surface. It's something that's going to receive the content, and the projector will work as a camera to output it. So it needs a mesh of some kind. Under the Mesh tab, we can choose different things. If this was instead, say, a dome, we could swap it out to a dome. And you'll notice that that dome looks really kind of stupid and distorted. The reason why is because we're scaling it there too. So the scale is going to allow us to alter the size of objects. When I prepare objects for D3, I try and leave them in a 1:1:1 scale. However, you may find yourself, say, receiving models that are in feet that you have to then convert to meters because everything in disguise is in meters, in which case you'd set the scale to be 0.845, I believe that's, or 485, which is the conversion factor from meters into feet. If I set this to be 1, 1, now we can see that we have a dome that makes more sense. Just a small 1 meter dome. If I put this back to the rectangle is one of the built-in meshes in D3. I didn't bring any fresh meshes in. We're just going to look at these for the time being. Oh, my little mouse wheel doesn't work. That's problematic. So, this is a 1 meter by 1 meter rectangle. For those of us who've been following UV stuff, it's UV mapped to take up the entire UV pixel space. I'm going to go ahead and put it back to its scale of 8 meters across by 4.5 meters tall, because the scale and the resolution work together. 8 by 4.5, for those of us who are really familiar with resolutions, that looks to be about half 16:9, or exactly half 16:9, which the resolution of this is 1920 1080, or one of our standard 16:9 resolutions. This means our pixels are going to be square in this case. We've taken that normalized UV space and we've multiplied it to make it 16 units across by 9 units tall. And that means that the resolution of 1920 by 1080 will give us good square pixels, which is usually our goal. Rectangular pixels don't help us that much, and in fact may often hurt us. So the scale and resolution work together for how content's going to apply, and it's based off of the mesh here. We've got the offset and the rotation. This is going to be the object's location in 3D space. As we move the x-axis, we can see it sliding back and forth. As we move the y-axis, it moves up and down, and z-axis moves it in and out. Fairly simple. Rotation is going to do the same thing. It rotates it in one axis. And note how it's rotating the center. That's because this mesh, the origin point of it when it was built in whatever 3D modeling program you want to use, is located right on the center of that object. That's an important thing to note, because if our origin point was, say, over here under the projector, as we rotate, we won't rotate around the origin of the object, the centroid of that object. Instead, we'll rotate around the projector itself, which means that if we realize, oh, we just need to tweak this and rotate it, say, around the x-axis so it's leaning back, there's a bit of a lean to it, that would actually cause it to start sliding along that axis, which is not nearly as helpful for us. So I like to zero these out and then put in their locations manually after pulling them from whatever 3D modeling program or from the Vectorworks file, but that's completely up to the user. So let's go ahead and let's make an object. If we right-click on stage, this is where we populate our stage with objects. There's a handful of various object types in D3. Under scene, this is where we get a thing called a venue. So I'm going to turn on the venue so that we see it really fast. And let's swap out this arena and instead make it the theater, which is normally what I'm working at. And mind you, this is not a great place for this projection surface to be in relationship to the theater, but it gives us a good idea of what the venue does. The venue is a way of creating a 3D model for us to work in. I will oftentimes, when I'm working on a show, do a quick drafting to get the model box and be able to bring that in so I have a sense of what the relationship's going to be like. It depends on the show. If you want to get really fancy about it, do the quick drafting, UV unwrap it, and then texture the walls to look like what the walls of the theater over here and over here actually look like, which a few of the D3 programmers are very robust at doing, which leads to a really great looking visualizer. It's much more true to life rather than working in this. But the props are really, the venue here is full of props, which are for the most part eye candy. They could be physical objects that you're trying not to project onto as well. So that's one other thing to keep in mind is, say, if you're working in, there's a couple theaters I've worked in that have massive pillars in the middle of the stage. I would bring those pillars in as a prop and use them so that the projectors won't hit them once they're calibrated. So there are nice uses like that. But I'm going to go ahead and shut the venue off so that we don't look at it the whole time. So we've got this whole group of objects. Two of them, DMX screens and DMX lights, are designed to output their information through DMX as opposed to the LED screens, the projectors, which are going to output them through that feed view that we were looking at before. I find these DMX screens can be very helpful, or DMX lights, and one of the things I use them for is actually for projector control, which is a little bit complex to set all of it up. I think the biggest takeaway I have comparing D3 to watchout is I need time to prep a show file. It's very rarely I show up on site and begin making the show file the same day as focus. I want to spend time making sure that my model assets are correct, bringing them all in, set up mappings, which we'll talk about once we get to that point on the timeline. And so projectors, I've now built a way to do it so I can just output them from a previous show and bring them in. But projector controls I'll use through a DMX light. DMX screens are going to output data directly to, say, lights that I want to control, a DMX screen, or I'll often use them for pixel mapping. Especially if you have a DMX screen of, say, all around your proscenium arch, there's a nice array of pixel tape that you want to be able to access and turn the same color as what D3 is doing. I'll build that as a DMX screen. That way, when I want to, I can feed that information to it. And if lighting's okay with it, someone has to manage how that DMX merge is going to work, but that way I can access it. There was a recent broadcast show I did for Disney where we had a bunch of pixel mapped LEDs throughout the set, and lighting didn't actually want to touch it. Instead, it was entirely driven from us using the content. So we could either just take it to a different piece, or they build much lower res content, so that way you basically just get the nice flashing of it. So projectors, those are the projector cameras, are going to look at projection surfaces and output what the projection surface is through the feed view. Note that projection surfaces don't show up in the feed themselves. I just see my projector. It's again because those projection surfaces are cameras. It also means that I can add multiple projectors per surface and then be able to deal with the blend there. I'm going to go ahead and make a couple LED screens just so we have something for a little bit more visual interest. So we're going to go ahead and make LED right. And we'll use its offset to move it over here. We'll center it up. Give it a 4:3 aspect ratio. So now we just have another source that we can put content on. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this to make LED left and just change its offset to be negative. So now I've got 3 screens that I can put content onto. We've got the labels for them. Just something a little bit more interesting to work with, to look at. It will give us something to play with once we get to the mapping discussion. If we head to our feed, you can see there's LED right and LED left. Oh, this should be 384 and 512. I've just memorized these numbers from doing trainings, so I don't always remember what they're supposed to be. But you can actually see a really interesting comparison there of the pixel space. LED left is currently the right 4:3 aspect ratio. This 512:384 is correct. However, LED right 584 by 312, that makes it more rectangular, and you can see the pixel space is different, even though on stage they look the same, because we're adjusting just the pixel space. So there's a bit of a layer of abstraction there between the object itself and the pixel space. And if we put a video onto LED left versus LED right, like say George, let's see how those two compare. So currently we have George on left. I think these may actually look fairly similar. Oh, there we go. Yep. Left looks more right, and right is a little bit distorted. So let's put this to 512 by 384, and now they look the same. So it's important to keep those aspect ratios and that scale matched up. Now, if I bring in an object, oftentimes the scale will just be 1, 1, and the aspect ratio just has to match whatever the UV is designed to receive its aspect ratio in. So does that make sense? If there are any questions as we're going along, please feel free to chime in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on that as well. So, LED versus projection surface. Let's now take a look at the timeline itself, and you'll notice some differences. So in a watchout timeline, you'll have the default, I think it's 12 layers stacked up, and you can put content on whatever layer, give that layer a name, lock individual layer. In D3, it's going to resize our timeline dynamically, but you don't have a specific, say, layer for objects. Instead, we have layer containers that will stack up together. So as I make a new layer, let's say a video layer. So Control L will bring up my layer selection box, or I can right click where I want to and make a new layer. Either way works. We're just going to throw a video layer in, and we'll make another, and we'll make another. So you can see they're stacking up. They're naming themselves dynamically, video, video 2, video 3. I would go and change these to whatever they need to be. But we've got this addition of space. D3, same as watchout, is going to do a top-bottom blend mode. So the bottom is going to be the base layer, and everything that builds up on top of it is going to cover up that base layer, depending on your blend modes. When it comes to blend modes, they're accessed in the actual layer. Whereas in watchout, you basically have you drag your layer on and you have a little bit of information in the layer settings that you can change, and then you can apply tween tracks. D3 gives you access to all of those tracks at once rather than applying them per video, which does mean that there's a lot of information per layer that we can work with. So let's look through all of these really fast. As far as keying goes, same as in watchout, you've got the ability to key. You can either set a color for the key, RG or B, the hardness and the threshold. You've got color shift abilities. You get your brightness, contrast, saturation, hue shift, and then you can adjust the red min and the red max. That gets to be a little bit weird. I suggest playing with it because it kind of adjusts away from the other ones. You can also go ahead and tint an object. Under default, we've got the color palette. And let me just put some content on stage so that we have something to look at while I play with that. And we'll put this onto the center screen. So you can see there we have Ada pulled up as our content. And this palette, I can adjust the X and the Y here. Or if I right click, I can actually select from the palette picker and change the color, and it will dynamically change that. Different option, just something to keep in mind of what you can do. You'll notice that my computer has a very hard time scaling things because it's default to work in 3000 by 2000 pixels, and I'm on an HD screen for my external monitor, so it gets very grumpy at times. So apologize if windows pop up massive like that palette. Should have been much smaller and take up about this, but again, it's all the weird scaling. So let's go ahead and let's set this back to be white because we don't need to change the color. So the color shift, keying, audio, if you have audio output, you can dictate what output you're using and dictate the volume. Notice how every time I click on these, we get its own little mini timeline. This is where we're going to do keyframe and change over time. So for some reason, I decided that the audio comes in at full, over 2 seconds, drops all the way down, and then 1.25 seconds brings itself back up to full. Don't know why you'd want to do that, but it's just a quick demonstration on how the keyframing works. So the move options, we've got size, we have scale X and Y. So if I want to distort this, I can go ahead and come in, make it longer or shorter. Note that when we get to -1, that's how we're going to flip around an axis. I can use the scroll wheel once I have that captured to change it as well. So that's scale X and Y. Size is going to move them all relative to one another. And then position X and Y, if I want to move it on the Y axis, I can adjust where it actually comes from. And I've got a center rotation if I decide I want to, say, flip it upside down or just spin it around. Good morning, Marcus, and welcome to class. So we also have the crop, which the crop is something that in the last few months, really, I've started using more and more. Crop is going to, as it says, let us crop in sides. Crop from the left, crop from the right. But what I find really interesting is we also have this vignette option. So I'm going to go ahead and drive in some crops so we can see what the vignette's going to do. And the vignette is going to give us a softening of those crops. So you can see there, let's zoom in while we work on it. As we adjust this vignette, we get a nice softening of the crop. But you notice it's cropped in on the bottom and the top as well. Well, there's actually a D3 way of dealing with this, which I need to talk to the developers about changing these, because currently the minimum is set to 0. If I set my min and max so that I can now reach to a minimum of -1, as I adjust the crop on the bottom, also set that to -1, look at what happens. It starts, let's do the top so that we're not blocking it. As we pull it out, you can see it adjusts the crop in the opposite direction so that we have actually less crop. So if we set the top crop to -1 and the bottom crop to -1, now we've got that vignette coming in nicely. Yes, feathering is another way to refer to it. Thank you, Sean Hooper, and good morning to you also. So just a nice way of being able to adjust those. I didn't really use those for a very long time, and I've been working with designers who use it constantly, so I'm starting to really mix vignetting into my workflow. And so you'll notice, since we're set to alpha, we've got transparency on either side. So if we threw a new video layer in of, say, George, and move it down, you can see now we are vignetting through and seeing both George and Ada on top of one another. And oh my God, that's a horrible image. I'm never going to use these two together for that again. Let's just make that something that's not atrocious. So yeah, vignetting back and forth between the two. And again, if we come in and pull this vignette out, it becomes solid the further and further out we bring the vignette. And if we have that vignette itself take itself to -1, nothing happens, because that's really glad that we have the mix of people who are awake and are still in bed. I would actually like to do these earlier, but I've been trying to time it for California time, mainly so that people like Marcus can see it. So notice pulling this vignette out doesn't do anything on the negative. That's why we have the ability to adjust these vignettes here. So instead, we pull out the vignettes we don't want rather than running out the vignette that way, if that makes sense. Let's go ahead and let's just unvignette this whole thing. Right, like that. We're back to our default image. So that's a look at the crop, move, keying, color shift. So let's talk about this media piece. Is that what you appreciate about me, Adam Bishop? So I'm going to swap this out so that we have a movie that we'll play through, because there are some important pieces to note about this. And we'll just go ahead and drop a couple timeline splits. Splits in the timeline are basically the same as your control cues inside watchout. And how I think of it whenever I do a show in D3 is treat every piece of video as if by default it's on free run and watchout. So in this case, we have currently this nice galaxy piece, and we're going to come here near the end so I can discuss what I'm talking about. The normal mode in D3 is the equivalent of the watchout free run. There's also the ability to lock it to timeline if you have something that you want to jam timecode with and just stay in line with timecode. Easy enough to do. At the end point, we can set it to loop, ping pong, play in reverse, or just hold, which is important for something like a transition video that we're playing. I'm going to go ahead and leave this at loop. We'll talk about transition time in a second. So you can see our playhead's moving. I just push spacebar to start playing. And look, we're held at the timeline and the video continues playing out. Like I said, it's the same as the way that watchout approaches everything in free run. I use these sections as cue markers. So for every cue in the show, I'm going to have one. So let's keyframe in to this video. Here is our opacity. It's currently set to 1. I'm just going to have it fade out my next cue over 5 seconds, so it reveals the video behind it. So now we play through, and we hit the end of the video and we hold. This solves one of my biggest issues with watchout, is the having to offset everything by a fraction of a second so that it doesn't start playing or slightly decrease the opacity of it. In this case, I was able to drop that keyframe directly at 1 second, and we have the split at 1 second as well, so it doesn't start the drop off. But now, if I take my next cue, you can see over the 5 seconds, it's going to fade out. So that's really how the queuing works in D3, is we'll make a bunch of sections of however long a length we need to. I normally make my sections 30 seconds long, and that's entirely a personal preference because it gives me a lot of time to be able to say, oh, we want a really slow fade up of this video in the first place, so let's make it a 19-second fade in. I've got plenty of time to do that, and at my default zoom level, I can snap to these sections very easily. If I do sections on 15, what I found is one zoom level in, it can sometimes be an issue to get to that 15. So that's why I like 30 seconds. Not necessarily important, but just something to keep in mind. Let's go ahead and merge that back. The shortcuts I'm using for this, I split the timeline with Alt-S. So I click where I want it. Alt-S will split it. And then if I want to undo a split that I have, I can choose to merge the section here, or Alt-M is the shortcut, and we'll merge it with the previous section from whichever one that you're in. So in this case, this red one will merge it with these two, right like that. And the alternating red-blue just tells us that there are section markers in there. If you switch over to quantizing, it's more of a green-blue. If I need a minute-long fade, so Adam in the chat just asked if I need a minute-long fade when I'm using 30-second sections, there's two ways I can handle it. Let me go ahead and set this up for it. So one way I can do it is by not having it there and putting into my crossfade a fade time of, say, 60 seconds, and you can see the slit here. That tells us that when we jump into that section, we will crossfade to it. The other way is I could just insert time up here for however long I need to. Click OK, layer section and audio, and you can see I just added 60 seconds to that section, easy enough. So now I could keyframe it out, but in this case, I do want to demo because that was one of the pieces I really like about D3, specifically for corporate things. At times, watchout's really great for corporate because their auxiliary timelines are more powerful than D3's. D3's multi-timeline gives you a lot of control, but it's very kludgy, as opposed to watchout, where I can have, say, aux timelines for each projector control, aux timeline for emergency things. Like if I want to just have a still I can bring up at any time, I can set that up as one of my aux timelines and have it pop up on top of everything else. In D3, we're going to look at transports in a little bit, and we'll look at how multi-transports work. And then just to demonstrate for Adam, as long as your playhead is moving, because currently you can see how this is flashing intensely, that means that the playhead's moving, just held at the end of the section. I can click go, and this will start the minute-long transition between the two. And so you can see not much has happened yet because it's a very, very slow fade. Oh, actually nothing will happen because I was dumb and left that there. Try again. Now you can start to see that peek through. And throughout the course of this 60-second fade, we'll get more and more of that and less of this. So it's just a universal crossfade between the 2 points. But that means that I could hop to another piece in the timeline and have that crossfade nicely as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop this because I think the idea is pretty self-explanatory at this point. And let's remove this crossfade. Set it to be undefined. I need to play with, in R17 they added this track section, and I haven't had a chance to sit down and really dive into what that does. So one last thing I wanted to demonstrate is a way to fake something that watchout does very well, which is their transitions. So if I want to, say, have in this an iris transition, I'm going to go ahead and make a bitmap layer. Move this down under the video. So this is a little bit weird. We're using a separate mapping or a separate blend mode, which is going to be a blend mode of mask. So mask blend mode is going to mask the layer above, similar to how you do that in watchout. I'm going to give it this circle mask transparent. So you can see it gives us that edge there. And let's swap out this video with something that gives us a little bit more there. So you can see now we have a bit of an iris. And what we're going to do to make this happen is just adjust the size. So it goes from 0, and then we'll come out. Let's give it 7 seconds. Until it reveals like that. So now we have a nice iris reveal. And you may have noticed there's a little bit of gunk around these edges. That's actually due to how it's dealing with the alpha. So we're going to switch the video, and I'll just do it right here so we see the change from alpha to pre-mult alpha. You can see that really cleans up those edges and gives us a nice, smoother piece to it. So you can see there is our iris reveal now. You'll notice that that's very pixelated because I'm just using a built-in D3 bitmap, which the circle mask transparent is only 36 by 36 pixels. So it does pixelate very obviously. I'd build something much larger for when we're doing this. Stacking order does matter for that. Anything that, so this is one of the little bit of weirdness. I can't, anything above that mask blend layer will be affected by it. So for instance, if I make a video right now and throw George on top, we won't see George. But if I bring him to the bottom, we can see through him, and then we get that reveal on top. And that's actually a much better way of seeing the differences between pre-mult and multiply. See the gunk on the sides here, and then when we switch the blend mode, see how it's snapped and it's much softer on the edges. That is what we were looking for. So I can come back here in the video and take out the alpha at the start. So now it's pre-mult the whole way across. So you can see a much nicer reveal. So yes, track stacking order does matter. And it's specifically designed to work with things on the same mapping and needs to be on the same mapping. I did a project that unfortunately is closed now, which makes me really sad because it's a really interesting video production of The Flying Dutchman. And we had a large RP screen that we're projecting onto, and we're projecting clouds on it. And partway through, we realized we wanted to be able to carve out the clouds and have interesting shapes to that whole backdrop. So I used a similar principle to this, but rather than using a transparent mask here, I'm going to go ahead and stop the size from changing. So that's this. I'm going to come over under textures and make a new texture. And that texture is going to be a soft edge texture. That we can adjust the size of. Oh, this not being able to middle mouse click is a really unfortunate issue. So you can see we're starting to shape. I really don't know what broke on that. We're starting to shape this out based on the bitmap that we're adjusting. There's the soft edge mask. Let's put it to 1080 like we meant, so it's sampling the full resolution. And we can use it to draw an interesting soft edge shape. You got those nice smooth edges. And so I was using one other interesting piece of D3 to change this out per scene that we wanted it to. And that was being able to use pardon me. Let's delete this keyframe before just so it's all taken care of. And that's being able to swap it out on the bitmap here to say the circle and use a transition time of say 5 seconds. Cool. So you can actually see it working right there. So now we've got that piece, and I'm going to go to my next section, and we'll spend 5 seconds to transition into the different look. It gets a little bit weird if you mix white on black versus white on alpha, so let's just fix that really fast by coming back here and change this to be alpha gradient. So now you can see through the two, and transitioning between, we can get back there. Just an interesting piece I've been tinkering with. So, finishing up a little bit of a chat about this timeline, down here we have 3 different play modes in D3. This play mode, which is actually just going to plow through sections, which I use very rarely, if ever. This, which loops sections, which means that when we hit the end of a section, we loop back to the start of it, which can be helpful if I want to keyframe, say, an interesting chase of color changes based on keyframes throughout time. I can then pop back to the start of it with this, or this played end of section hold, which is why I program most of my shows here, and then I hold. Previous section, next section. And then I can go ahead and add Q tags. So to add a Q tag, either right click and choose a tag, or Control T is the pass or the quick key for that. Q1, 2.5. If I'm going to give external control over D3, I'm going to put a Q tag at the front of these. And that means that for those of us working in theater, we'll drive it through MSC. For those of us working with other pieces of software, it may be different. And those are controlled through the transports. So there's a default transport for every show. For the most part, I stick to the default transport unless I need to enter a multi-transport world. And then I can assign a remote transport of, say, MSC, event transport MSC, and I can choose what my MIDI device is and my played end of section device, filter it if necessary, but this is how I can control my timeline playback from, say, an EOS if I want to through MSC. If you want to do that through OSC, check out Chat with Chet Edition 3, which goes through a lot of the OSC conversations back and forth between the two. But that's just a way to get out control. One last piece that we should talk about is mappings and what a mapping means. So when we're working watchout, basically we're bringing content onto the stage and it shows up in the relation between all of my screens. So Adam just asked how I can change the play mode via cues. I would actually use a layer for that. So if I want to, say, have Q2 be loop section, I just make a play mode layer and change the play mode in that section to be loop section. And then realistically, I'm going to put this here so that we have it, but you wouldn't need this in an actual show because every time you receive an MSC cue, it will change what your play mode is. But we can change this to be played in the section again. So now what happens is we jump to our next section, go, and note how we're now in loop section. So as we hit the end of that, obviously we'll loop back to the start, and that will continue for however long we need. And then when I take my next go, it switches it back to play the end of section. There's a lot of layer types in D3. As far as content goes, audio, video, web, I don't actually know what virtual lineup is. I'm going to have to play with that one because that's new too. The control cues are something that I find myself coming back to a lot because there's a lot of options for what we can do there. DMX Lite controls how I'm going to control projectors. A control layer is if I want to go to the olden days of PJ Link to control projectors, I'll make a control layer, give it the AVMT equals 31 or %31, whatever the full code is for the control layer. And then I can control it that way, choose the control device, which I'll have to make up in devices, and be able to control that or really any other device that will take a telnet command. I can trigger it through D3 in that way. A couple other layer types that are good to discuss. Matrix control if we want to do matrix changes. The open layer is one of the most... I should do an open layer lecture. I'm going to put that on the futures of layers to talk about because open gives us a lot of control over adjusting other things. The generative layers are just the ability to generate something, say an RGB color or a regular color, depending on if you want to select it from the color picker or select it from RGB. RGB color I use a lot because it's really great to patch an RGB layer to, say, these outside screens, or to projection map, say, something on set that lighting wants to occasionally be able to adjust the color on. I can patch these to DMX. And I'll also give them the intensity control. And now they can control that from their lighting console, RGB, and overall opacity of all of it. And I can just track that through my entire show, put on a top timeline or on the top transport, and not have to think about it. So, as we were starting to talk about, in watchout, we basically bring our content on the stage. And you can use virtual displays to basically be able to apply content from one place to another. That's how we can do 3D work as well. D3 has a bunch of different what we call mappings, which are different ways of addressing the stage. So currently, video 1 is direct map to surface 1. I can also come up here and make a new mapping here under the mappings option. And I'm going to make a side screens. I like to put the type of mapping it is in parentheses at the end because it helps me just keep things organized. And so that's going to be side screens direct. We'll choose a direct mapping. And I'm just going to go ahead and click the plus sign to add screens, LED left, LED right. So now, whenever I swap out media on this layer, it assigns it to both. Fairly simple. But it's a direct mapping, so it's either cropping to actually pull up this video to show it's, I believe it's under, there we go, cropping. It's under cropping. So it's clip type. It's currently set to be clip to canvas. We can also fit it to canvas, so it will fit whichever side, and then black bar the top and the bottom. We can make it pixel perfect. You can see the video itself is 636 by 450. It's a very interesting resolution. But that gives us that's a way to adjust these. The other way is through something called feed mappings. And feed mappings are one of my go-to mappings. Feed mappings are kind of like content templates, essentially. So let's actually go back into D3, into Windows Explorer. And on my desktop, I believe, I left the disguise training template. So I can use this as a demonstration for one use of feed mappings. So you can see D3 is going to auto-sync it. That is one very big difference between D3 and watchout is you have to push content manually to all of your servers from D3. There is no built-in content management. I use free, there we go. Free file sync. Which is my preferred method of content transferring. And basically, I'll create a master folder where everything goes into, and that master folder will push to every other computer on the network. So I'll oftentimes have that as my understudy, or it may be an external server of some type that I'll pull from and distribute to the rest of them. And the type that I use for that is, my computer's definitely getting tired. So I use update whenever I'm doing content transfers because I don't want to write over files. D3 grabs onto every file as it's playing so that you can't save over it like you can in some programs to do content updates. Instead, I just do the update that pushes across. In filter, I leave these out. I'll oftentimes also make a filter for .ds underscore store, which is internal OSX file that allows us to, it's how they do their indexing. And I just don't want it to be in every folder that they touch. So I'll usually filter that one out, but then the synchronization will allow me to update it. So let me go ahead and I'm going to show this disguised training template. We'll make a new mapping, which will be the feed mapping. Its type is feed. The first thing that I always do when I make a new mapping is I add in the screens they're receiving, in this case LED left, surface 1, and LED right. Then I'll set the resolution, which for this piece of content is 3000 by 1200. So in my resolution, 3000, 1200, right like that. And then I can right click, add feed rectangle, and drive these to the positions they're supposed to be in. LED left, add feed rectangle, and let's turn snap on because we'll like that. I don't remember what that's supposed to be. 2100 by 100. Add LED right. So you can see this is based off of that template. These all show up exactly where they're supposed to on stage. And what I can do with a content template like this is I can build an After Effects project based off of this template, build off the UV map or however I want to face it, but that way they feed things to me and we know exactly where it's going to pop in on stage. So that's one way to deal with that. We could also deal with a similar issue just by doing a parallel mapping, which is going to be based on the 3D environment and why it's nice to work in 3D. So I'll make a new mapping, which is going to be parallel mapping. We'll add in our 3 screens, LED left, LED right, surface 1. Let me put content on so that we can see what we're doing as we do this. We'll do the street. So you can see they show up red here as we're adding this mapping because they're not currently part of the mapping. So we turn off the aspect lock, set the size to be 8 by 4.5 because this video is 1920 1080. So the size is right. We'll lock it back to the aspect ratio. And then I'm just going to go ahead and roll this size up. Oh, I should actually set the resolution before I do that. Right, like that. Now we'll lock to aspect ratio and rolling this up. We're covering this whole piece. And so you can see this is the same as if we just drug a piece of content across all the screens, as opposed to the feed map that would use the template as the equivalent of virtual displays. We can get a little bit fancier with those as well. We have a perspective map, which is the same thing, but rather than being a flat emitting rectangle, it's going to be a point that emits out and broadcasts, as if it's a kind of source projector, or if you reverse it, think of it like a camera, as one does camera captures from, say, Cinema 4D. So if you build all of your stuff based on that, you can output it. The other nice thing about this is, and let's swap out for, I really like the ball video. This is a good demonstration video for it. So this is our orbiting galaxy again. The other nice thing about D3 rendering of it is as we're tracking back and forth, we're moving through that window. Similar to how if we're going to drive it through watchout space, but it's also based on real world units rather than a pixel space basis. So I find the maths are far easier whenever I'm doing that. And note, as we get higher, we have that whatever is on the feed map is poking through there. The feed map sticks to it wherever it goes, same as how the virtual display would. So that's kind of a basis on how those mappings go. Let's really quickly look at how we patch all of these outputs. So over here in the feed, we have these outputs that we can patch out. And it's simply a matter of left click and dragging with the Alt arrow key held down, and we can move these onto the outputs. I only have my computer I'm looking at right now. If I was to build up a full D3net session, which we can do D3net manager, I can make a fake show. I'll make myself master and add in a 4x4 slave, sets type to be 4x4 Pro. And now I can accomplish the same thing, but mapping to the various outputs on the 4x4. I can also map, you can see that's my current visualizer camera. So wherever this is, that will map it across. So the last thing I want to really quickly touch on is if we go back to stage, what if I want to calibrate this projector? Because yes, it's currently outputting from the real world, but let's just move the projector a little bit over this way, move it back here. So it's currently overshooting. And if we zoom into this, we can see great, that's how we're overshooting. We've got these corners. We need to show it exactly where it's going to be in the real world. So I'm going to go ahead and patch this to my GUI, which is obviously going to be really obnoxious in the way, but I can Alt-G so we can close that and actually scale this down in size. We'll just hold Shift so it maintains 0, 0, and unlock from aspect ratio so that we can stretch and skew it. So now Alt-G will show us that up here in the corner. I'm going to look to make sure that shows up fine on the output. Yep, great. So back in stage, if I want to calibrate projector 1, what I'm going to do is right-click on projector 1, and then over here under calibration, I'm going to right-click to edit the calibration. So the first thing I need to do is manage the points. So I'm just going to click on vertices in the model that I can find. Demoing this on a flat screen is actually not the best idea because you usually need 6 points to really get to a good lineup, but this can at least give us a feeling for it. So I've got 4 points there that I can work with, and now I'm going to choose lineup points, and look what happens when I grab one of these points. My output becomes a cursor as I define where each of these is going to be in the real world. So imagine that is the output from the projector. I can line it up with wherever that's going to be. And you can see how it's adjusting it a little bit as it tries to calculate exactly where the projector needs to be in relation to make that happen. So it's adjusted where those are supposed to be, and that's adjusted the output. So that's how I go about calibrating said projector as well. That's looking at one projector. And then if we're going to do it that way, let me undo everything I just did. Notice it locks the settings because it doesn't want you to move a projector after it's calibrated. So I'm going to go back here and come back under reset I'm going to reset my reference point lineup. It gives me access to it again. We'll move this back to be 0, minus 12. So currently we're seeing the whole thing. Let me duplicate this projector and make projector 2. We'll drag projector 2 off to the side. We'll drag projector 1 off to this side. And we're also going to change their look at points. So if they're not looking right at center, in this case, minus 1.5. And projector 2, 1.6. So now we see only part of the screen here for either one. And let's put a piece of content that's a bit more obvious there. We'll put it to surface 1 direct. Cool. So you see there's part there. If we go back to the feed, we can see that projector 2 is seeing a similar part of it. So if I want to blend these projectors, there's 2 options. I can either do it manually, or if we come up here to Stage under Projectors, I can turn Dynamic Blend on. You can see it's calculating where the overlap between the projectors are and blending between the two, which is honestly what I do for most shows whenever I have to do that blend. There's one other way to handle it, which is something I'm going to demonstrate really quickly, and that's not using a surface at all. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and pull surface 1 out of these 2 projectors so D3 doesn't yell at me when I do this. I'm going to change this surface type to be an LED screen instead of being a projection surface. I'm going to set its resolution to be 2 times 1920. Which we may or may not want to blend that, but at least gives us something else to deal with. So now we can see, oh great, this is stretching across like this. How am I going to blend these 2 together? I'm going to add a feed rectangle and I'll split it in half. I'm going to move these rectangles in just a little bit so we do have some overlap between the 2. Delete that because we don't need it anymore. So here we have one output. Here we have the other output. I can go ahead and make a new soft edge mask just like we did earlier. Soft edge texture. It's going to apply on top. And what I'm going to do is pull out this side, pull out this side, pull these 2 up. I'm going to hold shift so that we move only in one axis while I'm doing that. Shift so we move only in one axis. And drag these 2 off. So now I can adjust these 2, and I like to move these out on top and bottom because I don't care about that side because we're pulled all the way out. But this means I can adjust here to change what that blend looks like. And if we come back along this, you can see that's a very shallow blend. We can extend it out. If we need to move where the actual endpoint of it is, I can drag it out that way. And then I can do the same for the other side and blend that way. If these are projectors doing that, then I can actually edit the warp and apply a warp on top of it. A simple 4-point warp will allow us to just warp the corners. but we also have 9-point or a custom grid if we want to get really fine-tooth. One thing I've used a custom grid for is to really isolate onto a section. So if I scale this down, I can then move this warp to a specific point that I need to touch up because maybe there's objects I have to work with in that section, and I'm treating it like an LED wall. So that's really kind of a fundamental look at how D3 operates through a watchout point of view. The warping doesn't have the Bezier handles, which are really nice in watchout. So like I said, in a 2D workflow, watchout is in some ways more powerful than D3. I much prefer working in D3's timeline, and I like having the ability to do these mappings, which I use really frequently. I'm going to go ahead and drop out of this. And are there any questions from what we've been going over today? Kind of an interesting crash course. I have a friend who I'm going to bring on, assuming I can figure out how Skype works into XSplit. And we're going to do kind of a chat on that transition from watchout to D3 programming, because he actually has been doing a lot of watchout work and then has done his first couple shows in D3 just a few months ago. So it's going to be interesting to get the point of view of someone very early in that transition process and what they've learned about D3, what they miss about watchout. So, yeah, any questions from anyone watching? Sean asks, he wants to double check the stacking order of the timeline. The stacking order is top down. So the very top object will appear on top of everything else, which is the same as watchouts. The mask layer is reversed, yes. The mask layer basically is treating itself like mask layer above. If we want to organize the timelines, let me pop back into D3. Yes, the stacking order is top down, and if we want to change how layers are stacked, give me a moment while I vamp, but there's either we can right click on the layers to shortcut for it. And if I want to move, say, my feed map layer on top, I can just right click here and choose move up. Or move down. Or I can use Control Alt and arrow keys up and down, and that will move them in the stacking order. And so D3 will continue stacking up layers as long as we have layers until it gets to another blank space, and it will drop everything back down to this bottom place. I've gotten to see some really big D3 stacks, especially if you have a lot of circuits. Oh, whoops. Thank you for that. There we go. This will bring us back to my D3 view, which let me just double check that XSplit took that. It did. So here we have two that are on top of one another, and let me put this back to be 1920. So if I want to move this up or down, I can either right click on it and choose move up or down. That moved it down. This moved it up, or hold Control Alt and arrow keys will move up and down in that order. So you can see it's moving in relation to this other cue that it has as well. So that's how that layer stacking order lays out. D3 doesn't have a good... It has a multi-transport that allows us to play multiple timelines together as opposed to the much shorter aux timelines you can get, but I can also have multiple tracks per show. you cannot custom build D3 servers for output. You have to use D3 hardware for playback. Mainly, part of it's from a support standpoint because I had enough problems troubleshooting people's laptops, let alone trying to troubleshoot the custom servers they built. I really kind of appreciated that. And to be honest, I don't know I would build my own server for playback, but I know I'm in a different point of view from that than many owner operators feel. D3 does have, it's a CodeMeter based program. I have a D3 license, which I use for previs, and I can actually join into a session as what we call an editor. And so when I'm calibrating projectors, I will oftentimes do it from my laptop wandering around the stage. Because when we looked at how to do the projector warping, I can do that projector warping wirelessly or wired into the server from my laptop and be able to be much closer to it rather than being all the way back at the tech table. Any other questions? It depends. Watchout I see a lot in smaller events. The larger scale events, I see a lot of D3. There's also Pixaria starting to come in. There's a couple of companies that really like it. There's a couple of companies that are still very much in Pandora's box workflow. I don't see much Hippo in events. Oh, that's one thing I meant to show that I totally didn't. So, I talked a little bit about how D3 handles content, how you have to push it between multiple computers. So this is my video file folder. Here is some content stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in, I only have the proxy files. I remember that now. So, oh, my computer is really angry trying to share this across. Cool. So let's go ahead, split our timeline. And we're going to use this video of a car. That works fine. So you can see it's just a simple car loop. But what I'm going to do is demonstrate what happens because the video itself has a version tag attached to it. So if I come over here and grab my file v2 and drop it in to my file folder, note how it popped to blue immediately. That's because we've now brought in a different proxy of this video. Or sorry, not a different proxy, a different version. So the version tags allow us to switch back and forth. Down here under versions, we've got our video asset, and we can go back and forth between the versions of the car. And so that's something I work with constantly is new versions, or even to the tune of frame match versions. Because if we look here, I've got what frame this starts off in. So if we wait till we get to the right section, it will frame match over just a portion of it. So you can see it's blue car for most of it, except for these moments where it's green and it's video assetting over that piece. So we can see here the file name underscore. I have these all as proxy files. I don't have the full res, which is great because my laptop is struggling already. So my file version 1, that was our base file. Version 2 is the second we brought in. Version 3, we also have a frame number. That's the frame number. It will stop. It will drop down. Yes, everything that's in the media folder is in the project. So assuming it's on all the computers, which I said earlier I use free file sync to push them across, as soon as you have access to it, there's no transfer across in that regard. I can pull anything that's directly into the project folder. I know I'm in the minority. I really don't trust live update and watchout, mainly because I'll end up typing too fast and I've crashed live update every time I've turned it on. I had to try it from the very start of a project because I always forget it's a thing. And I just get in a real big habit of Control S, Control D, and that's my usual watchout workflow when it comes to that regard. But yeah, anyone can copy those media files to the folder. I always have everything shared on the network. Usually, I'll have someone wrangling media of some type, which is sometimes me, depending on the size of the show, and that person's making sure that everything drops to the right place. Ideally, they're also checking things like frame rate, resolution, making sure the naming's proper so that this versioning actually works. Because if we have a typo in the name of that file, obviously the versioning, it won't realize it's part of the same asset tree and roll it up. I actually, so Sean is asking in the chat if HAP is the preferred codec or if everything is Notch LC now. And HAP is a much better looking codec. I will openly admit that Notch LC is gorgeous. However, Notch LC is a much higher. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Is a much higher. It takes more processing. Notch LC is roughly like napkin math equivalent to HAP-Q, which is a big step up from HAP or HAP alpha. So I find myself still using a lot of HAP because I'll be dealing with massive pixel canvases, which Notch LC, I can't put enough videos on to really take it over. I think Notch LC is going to continue to be more and more important, but HAP is still a major player for us. But Notch LC looks so much better in gradients, and you don't have to dither it like we have to in HAP. The last show I did was entirely LED wall, and so LED wall with lots of very, very slow fades. So I found that the majority of my job was chasing dithers and trying to make everything crossfade properly and not have that kind of blocky gradient that we'll get with really the 8-bit output from the LED processors. I would have loved to have run it at 10, but that was unfortunately not an option because we were on 2x4s. I saw that watchout now has SDI output capability, which that should be interesting. I'm excited to try that. Any other questions from anyone watching? Oh, it's only on the Dataton boxes? That makes sense. Can you run, say, HDMI out into at 1080 into a decimator box and convert that successfully, or does that handshake not work out? Okay, great. Yeah, the 4Ks are really nice. It's nice to be able to convert to 12G. All right, well, we'll just take a moment if anyone else has more questions that we can cover. Um, like I said, next week at noon, I'm going to do this again. I'm going to get my friend Ted to come in so that we can get an kind of point of view of someone who has just made the transition, is using both D3 and watchout professionally, to see how early on in his watchout or his D3 career rather he's feeling about the two software platforms and tricks between the two. But yeah, thank you all for joining me. It's been a pleasure. We ran a little bit longer than usual this time, so I'm going to go ahead and call it for today. You're all quite welcome, and I will see you all next time. I'm going to go get some lunch. Have a nice night.